Welcome to Speaking of Grace, the weekly message podcast from the Whole Life Church in Orlando, Florida. We're a multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-generational congregation committed to our mission of loving people into a lifelong friendship with God. We are committed to our vision of being a church without walls, fully engaged in serving the people of our community. Thank you for joining us as we continue Speaking of Grace.
Hey Ken, my favorite Bible story is the story of Joseph, and here's why. Just like Joseph, I was also brought to a foreign country against my will, so to speak. And like him, I also overcame a lot of difficulties. I look forward to hearing how you can make that into a sermon, and that's it.
All right, challenge accepted, Mariana. Let's see how I can make this into a sermon. So her favorite verse is Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. If you're not just familiar with that verse, let me go ahead and put it up for you. Joseph is talking to his older brothers after his fathers died. They're kind of a little scared of him because they've been not particularly nice to him earlier in his life, and they're afraid that he's going to go ahead and get even with them. And this is Joseph's response. He said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so that I could save the lives of many people." So in order to understand this verse, you need to understand the story of Joseph. And to understand the story of Joseph, I need to tell you Joseph's story. So what I want you to do, whether this is a refresher for you or you've never heard this story before, I want you to listen carefully, because through the story that I'm about to tell you, there's going to be a major theme, a thread, if you will, that's going to be woven through this story that I'm going to be telling you. And I want you to see if when we get to the end of the story, you can pick it out. So basically, the story begins in Genesis chapter 37. It begins with Jacob, Joseph's father, doing something that might not have been the smartest thing to do. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children. And he had 10 other children at this point, right? 12 if you include Joseph's younger brother, Benjamin. And because Joseph had been born to him in his old age, and the writer doesn't say this, and to his favorite wife. And so one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. And I'm sure you have heard through pop culture, Joseph's amazing Technicolor coat, or, I'm sure you've heard, Joseph's coat of many colors. And that's nice. The original language does not necessarily support that it had many, many colors in it. What's really important for you to understand about this garment was that in everyday life in those times, I know that we walked into our closet this morning and many of you had a plethora of options of what you were going to wear this morning. But for people living in that time, if they had more than one change of clothes, they were probably pretty wealthy. And so when people wore clothes, it had significance. And in Joseph's time, that Near Eastern culture, clothing was a legal and social marker of identity, authority, and status. And this coat that Jacob gives to Joseph is telling the entire world and rubbing his other son's nose in the fact that not only is Joseph his favorite, but he's probably going to be his heir. That while the other brothers are going to have to serve, all those older brothers are going to have to serve Joseph most likely. And it kind of makes sense because Jacob was a second born who figured out how to cheat his way into the firstborn status. And so he might not have been that, from his son's viewpoint, they might not have been too afraid, thought, Dad's probably not going to be too afraid to go ahead and elevate a younger son. And that garment sealed it. That's what's going on. Dad has a favorite, it's obvious, and he's giving Joseph authority over us. Joseph doesn't help himself out because he has a couple dreams that he shares with the family that put him in a position to appear like he is going to have authority over everybody. They don't like that very much. And meantime, Joseph sends his other sons, not Joseph, because Joseph is his favorite. Joseph gets to stay home. He sends his other sons away to take care of the herds. He sends them away to a place called Shechem, and they're taking care of the herds there. Time goes by, and Jacob says to Joseph, I need you to go and find out what your brother's up to. And this is not unusual for Joseph because Joseph is a snitch. He had told on his brothers before. And so his brothers could expect that when Jacob sends Joseph to look for them, Joseph not going to lie about what they're doing, but he's also not going to cover up for them if they've been up to no good. And so Jacob sends Joseph off to find the boys. The boys are not around. They are not where they thought they would be. So Joseph gets a little help. He's sent to where they're at. And they see him coming from a ways off. Enough time to make a plan. Snitches get stitches. And in this particular case, we're going to kill him. I've had enough of this kid. Who does he think he is? And what does dad think he's doing? We're going to kill this guy. Now, the other brother, older brother, who is in a little bit of trouble with Jacob for reasons I won't go into here right now. This will be another series, I'm sure. But the older brother is like, hey, maybe I can get into dad's good graces if I convince the brothers not to kill him, but to just go ahead and throw him into a pit. And then I'm going to rescue him, send him home, and maybe I can get back on dad's good side. So that's what he does. He convinces, let's not kill him right away. Let's just put him in this pit over here while we, think about what we're going to do. So they put him in a pit. For some reason, Reuben, the oldest brother, goes off somewhere for a minute. And while he's gone, these Ishmaelite traders, which remember, these are cousins of the brothers. The Ishmaelites are Abraham's oldest son, Ishmael. And then there's, Isaac. And so these Ishmaelite traders come along, and so nothing like selling your family to family, right? And so the brothers pull Joseph out of the pit. They sell him to the Ishmaelite traders for 20 pieces of silver. And then they are going to send him off into slavery. And a little detail that I should have mentioned to you earlier, because I let it go, is that they tear off his robe, because their idea is they're going to take away his authority. They're going to tear it off of him. And once they've sold him to the Ishmaelite traders, they say, we're going to have to come up with a story for dad. We can't really go home and say, hey, dad, we sold your favorite son into slavery because you kind of annoyed us. We got to come up with a better story than that. So they killed a goat. They dip this torn up garment into the blood, and then they go home. They're like, hey, Dad, we found this. Does it look familiar? Is that what Joseph might have been wearing? And Dad, Jacob, loses it. He goes into mourning, and he's like, yeah, that's my son. A wild animal must have got him and torn him apart, and it nearly kills Jacob. Meantime, off to Egypt, Joseph goes. He gets to Egypt, and he's sold to a very high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court, a guy named Potiphar. And you can only imagine that Joseph probably started off at the bottom of Potiphar's list of slaves. But Joseph was also the son of Jacob, a very wealthy person. And Jacob probably had done a pretty good job of educating Joseph on what it meant to do work and to be refined. As some might call it in some circles that I'm in, executive presence. And so Joseph rises quickly in Potiphar's home to the point where he's eventually running everything. The Bible says that Potiphar is so happy. And by the way, how many of you, interrupting myself, how many of you like having employees that you can just hand them a project and never think about it again? The best. The absolute best. And that's exactly what Joseph is. Potiphar doesn't have to worry anything, he said, basically the Bible says, except choosing the menu for the evening dinner. And the only things that are off limits in Potiphar's house to Joseph is his wife. And the Bible goes out of its way to say that Joseph was a nice looking guy. And Potiphar's wife notices. and she tries to convince Joseph to sleep with her. And Joseph declines. He says to her, "How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against Potiphar." No, he says it would be a great sin against God. Remember last week we talked about David saying, "Against you and you alone have I sinned"? Here's another example in the Bible of that Hebrew idea and concept that the most important person that you could harm is God. So Joseph declines, but Potiphar's wife does not take no for an answer. And one day she finds Joseph alone in the house and she says, "Hey, we're alone." And Joseph said, "Yep, and I'm out." And he starts to leave and she grabs the cloak that he's wearing, rips it off of him. And this is what she does. She takes it and she says, this guy that you hired, Potiphar, the guy that you've given control over our house, look, I have his cloak in my hand because he tried to come and rape me. And Potiphar has no options. He can't believe a slave over his wife. And the Bible says he was very angry. Some theologians wonder whether he was angry at Joseph or if he was angry at his wife. But he's angry, and he has Joseph thrown into jail. One of the reasons why I would suggest that I think he was more angry at his wife than he was at Joseph is because he doesn't have Joseph killed, which would have been his absolute right to do. Rape was a death penalty situation. And the fact that he doesn't kill Joseph on the spot, in my mind, says that there was some doubt in his mind about whether Joseph had really done what his wife was accusing him of. But he has no option. He can't say, "My wife was trying to seduce him, so we're just not going to go ahead." And he had to do something. So he throws Joseph into jail. So yet again, Joseph is stripped of the garment that gave him his authority, put into a new situation in a jail. And just like before, cream rises. And Joseph, the Bible says God blesses Joseph in jail until he rises to the point where yet again, he has the warden of the prison who doesn't even have to worry about being the warden anymore because Joseph is taking care of everything. Well, two guys get thrown into jail, and it's significant. They're Pharaoh's chief baker and Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, two very prominent positions within the kingdom. And apparently Pharaoh's trying to figure out what to do. Maybe Pharaoh thought that these guys were involved in a plot to kill him, and he was not sure which one it was, and he was trying to sort it out. But they both get thrown into prison. They both have dreams. Joseph interprets those dreams for them. For the baker, he says, "You're going to get executed." For the cupbearer, he says, "You're going to get restored to your place holding the king's cup." And by the way, when that happens, would you just mention to him that there's this guy in prison who's not there fairly, and could you maybe work out a pardon for me since I kind of let you know something nice about you? And the cupbearer's like, "Oh yeah, absolutely, thank you, 100% will do that." And then he did what a lot of people do after they get a favor, they forget about it. And the cupbearer, everything that Joseph said happened. Baker gets executed, cupbearer is returned, cupbearer forgets all about Joseph, doesn't say anything until one day, the Pharaoh of Egypt has a dream, two dreams specifically, that distress him greatly. Nobody can tell him what it means. And so Pharaoh is, what do I do? And at that point, the cupbearer is like, "Wait a minute, I know a guy. He's a Hebrew in prison, though." Pharaoh's like, "We got nobody else. Send for him." And the Bible says that when Pharaoh sends for Joseph, Joseph at once was quickly brought from the prison. After he had shaved and changed his clothes, he went and stood before Pharaoh, because you can't very well go into the leader of the free world wearing prison clothes unshaven. So he changes into a new set of clothes, goes in, and Pharaoh tells him his dream. Joseph interprets the dream for Pharaoh. And the basic gist of it is this: there's going to be 7 years of plenty, the best years you've ever seen. The GDP is going to go crazy. The stock market's going to go through the roof. It's going to be amazing for the next 7 years. But here's the thing: the 7 years after that, the exact opposite. There is going to be a crash like no crash you've ever seen. Food's going to go in scarcity. There's going to be a massive famine that's not just going to affect you, Pharaoh, in Egypt. It's going to affect the entire world. So here's the plan, Pharaoh. If you want to know what I think, what you need to do is you need to find a smart person to be in charge of collecting 1/5 of the grain that's harvested during the years of plenty that can be put that aside for the years when there's not going to be enough. Pharaoh looks around at all his boys and he's like, hey, this guy seems pretty smart. You probably ought to make him in charge of that. I mean, if he can interpret the dream, he's come up with a good plan. Anybody have a problem? Let's do this. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Once again, things have shifted. Joseph is clothed with authority and given the power to rule an entire nation, second only to Pharaoh himself. Well, 7 years go by, just the way that Joseph said they would, and then the next year after that comes along, and exactly what Joseph said would happen happened. The crops didn't grow, famine was in the place, and now Joseph and the Pharaoh get to basically take all the wealth of the country and compile it just for the Pharaoh. Well, as Joseph had said, this famine affected the whole region. And his brothers and his family were impacted by it to the point where they heard that in Egypt there was food. So Jacob sends his sons, 10 of them, not Benjamin, sends 10 of them to Egypt to ask for food. And it's a long story that I'm not going to get into, but there's a back and forth. Joseph starts testing his brothers to see if they're the same people that sold him to slavery or if they've had some character growth in between. At the end of the test, Joseph determines that his brothers have changed, that their character is different. And he reveals himself to them at this point and says, I'm your brother that you sent. They're obviously terrified. What? Wait. And Joseph's like, hey, no. You're forgiven. And to show that he's forgiven them, Joseph gave each of them new clothes. But to Benjamin, his brother, who eventually shows up, he gave 5 changes of clothes. So Jacob and the brothers and the family are brought to Egypt. They're set up in the best part of the land. They stay there for a long time. Jacob actually dies there. Once he dies, they take his body back to be buried in Canaan. And when they get back, that's when this whole back and forth happens with the brothers being like, hey, Dad told us before he died that he didn't want you to get even with us. I don't think he said that, but they were making it up because they're like, hey, we could be in a lot of trouble now that Dad's not alive to stop this from happening. Well, let me ask you a question. As you hear this story, do you hear a theme weaving through it? What do you hear? This is a part where you can talk to me if you want to. Say it again. God leads. Yeah, for sure. Do you see a literary device in there? An engine that may be driving this story? Because theologians that are literary scholars, and scholars see in this a literary device that's being used. Clothing. Did you notice that almost at every major intersection of the story, there's a clothing issue? At the very beginning, Jacob gives a beautiful and expensive piece of clothing to Joseph to wear. A symbol of authority. The brothers rip away that clothing, dip it in blood, and pretend like Joseph has died. Joseph winds up in Potiphar's house. He again attains clothing that would have given him status, and that status, yet again, that clothing is ripped off of him with lies. And he returns back to 0 in prison. He's given clothing to appear in front of Pharaoh, but that clothing is not appropriate enough for somebody who's going to be second in charge. And so he's given even finer clothing to wear as the second in command in Egypt. And then, when he forgives his brothers, when he lets his brothers know that everything's okay, he gives them clothing. He gives them a new change of clothes. How ironic that you tore this clothing off of me, and now I am giving you clothing to wear. But if you really want to understand this, if you really want to, if you're like, I don't know, Ken, I mean, is that really what's going on here? You really need to take a look at Genesis 50:20 again. Remember how when we read it, it said, you intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. You remember that? So the word that gets translated intended actually means weaved. You weaved evil. God weaved good. There's a medieval commentator named Rashi who emphasizes that the brothers' thoughts were entirely bound by the word evil, whereas God's thoughts seamlessly transformed that exact data point into good. In other words, there's nothing that humans can create that God can't recreate. There's nothing that can be woven into your life that God can't reweave. There is nothing that can be taken away from you that God cannot give back something better. You weaved evil. Human beings will weave evil. But God, the master weaver, takes what human beings weave and transforms it into something beautiful, something that saves lives, something that gives life. In other words, God doesn't just react to human history. He's actually the ultimate weaver who takes that history and weaves it for his purposes. God is the ultimate weaver of your life. There are those of you who walked in here today suffering, and you're wondering what God would allow that to happen to you. Like Joseph, you have been stripped of things that matter to you, that gave you importance and significance and meaning. And you wonder, has God forgotten me? I hope the story of Joseph today will remind you, and because it's easy to read the story and we know the outcome, but Joseph did not. You do know that from the moment he was sold into slavery until he became the prime minister, there were 13 years of heartache and fear and uncertainty. And for those of you who have walked in here today thinking, yeah, God did it for Joseph, I want to say again, God is the ultimate weaver. He takes the raw, ugly threads of human betrayal, tragedy, and heartache, and he weaves them into a larger tapestry of redemption.
Hi, this is Randy McGray, podcast producer and host here at Whole Life Church. Loving people into a lifelong friendship with God is our mission at the Whole Life Church, and our podcasts are designed to help facilitate conversations that help us grow together in that pursuit. Now that you've heard the message for this week, don't forget to check out the Whole Life takeaways for this message. Swipe up in today's show notes and join the conversation. Speaking of conversations, each Wednesday morning we take a closer look at the week's message. That's right, the one you just listened to. We discuss practical ways to apply spiritual lessons and ask honest questions about the issues we face as Christians, all focused through the lens of grace. Your voice is a welcomed addition to that conversation. We encourage your thoughts and your questions by sending a voicemail or text to 407-965-1607 or send an email to podcast@wholelife.church. You can find everything podcast related on our website, wholelife.church/podcast. And plan on spending every Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning with us as we bring you the Whole Life Church inspiration you love straight into your headphones. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.